Welcome to 3 Point Cyber, a podcast about cybersecurity topics and events for the layperson. The ideas, opinions, and discussions of this podcast are those of the host, co-host, and guest, and do not necessarily represent the views of their respective employers or affiliates. Recording and propagation of this podcast is highly encouraged as long as an acknowledgement is given to the ownership. Music and graphics used in the podcast and promotional materials cannot be used in other events not tied to the podcast without the express written consent from Alpha Omega Advisors. Welcome to the inaugural episode of 3 Point Cyber. I'm your host, Dave Summit, and joining me to bring you what I hope to be a unique podcast is Andrew Risch. Welcome, Andrew.
Thanks, Dave. Glad to be here.
So Andrew is joining us from Poland, where he's officially on duty in the U.S. Armed Forces. So he's up a little late tonight as we record this, so I hope he's not going to fall asleep on us or I hear any snoring going on.
There is that 6-hour difference. I am good to go. I've got my coffee, actually, and I say that, some people say I drink too much coffee. I say I can't get enough. So,
Well, our intent of this is to bring you to a higher level of awareness to the field of cybersecurity, and we certainly thank you for joining us. This isn't just for those who are in the cyber field and practicing cyber things, but also for organizational leaders, C-suites, directors, managers, board members, and other professionals wanting and needing to know more about, but aren't sure where to turn. So that's why we started this podcast. I also want to say that this is not a technical podcast. This podcast is intended to keep it at a high level with emphasis on most important items that we need to take away from each episode. We'll end each time after the guest interview and then 3 things we believe you should take away. So, Andrew, how things going over there, and just general overall, how you doing since we did our intro podcast?
Yeah, well, if you're watching the news, things are a little tight here right now. But overall, I'm doing great. Thanks for asking. I do have one question before we start, because in your intro, you mentioned something that I have heard now for the second time this week, C-suite. So people like me do not know what a C-suite is. Can you explain what a C-suite is?
Absolutely. Yep. C-suite is the C-level leadership of an organization, the CEO, CFO, CIO, CISO, etc.
I know what those are.
Yeah, so
okay,
that's what we're referring to with the C-suite. Thanks for clarification on that, Andrew. Again, that's why Andrew's here. We in our we talk in our cyber field. We have a tendency to know what each other's saying, and people that are outside the ring sometimes can get lost. So that's why we've got Andrew here to help us keep us in line. So right after this,
glad to do it.
Yep. So right after this, we'll welcome our guest. Welcome back to 3 Point Cyber. This episode is titled, Don't Bury Your Head in the Sand. I've already had some feedback about this title, Andrew, from someone you know. I won't mention him right now, but we'll talk about that later. He mentioned that when I gave it that title, he just didn't think that was a really good title to keep him interested. And quite frankly, I'm new to podcasting, so I didn't even give it much thought to about what a title of a podcast should be. So
what's his problem? The sand?
The sand, yeah. He said, why?
No, you're from Florida, so you got a lot of sand.
I know, but it's one of those things where I think he mentioned that it's something like, well, I don't want my head in the sand. Why would I want to listen to something? That sounds very painful. So in any case, well, I'm extremely excited and honored to introduce our guest today. I first met him when I was in residence for a master's degree at Norwich University several years back. He was a great lecturer for the program, and it was memorable. I still have 8 pages of notes from that lecture, and to this day, I still reference that lecture when I need material and reminders about what I'm doing in the field.
Wow.
Dan Lohrmann currently works for Presidio as a Chief Field Information Security Officer for the public sector and a client advisor. Dan's experience has earned him frequent accolades and awards from numerous areas in the cyber industry. As an internationally recognized cybersecurity leader, keynote speaker, and blogger, Dan has earned him a spot as a trusted source of cyber information and advising. Dan was the first Chief Information Security Officer for the state of Michigan, and during his tenure created one of the top security programs in the nation, and its operations is being used in numerous areas as best practice. Dan has authored several books and contributed to countless others. His latest book, where he is co-author with Shamane Tan, is Cyber Mayday and the Day After, a leader's guide to preparing, managing, and recovering from inevitable business disruptions. Dan, welcome to the show, and thank you again for taking the time to share with others what needs to be said in cyber.
Dave, it's wonderful to be with you. Thanks so much. Very kind, too kind introduction, but it's great to be with you and Andrew today.
Well, again, Dan, I'm very honored that you were able to join us. And with that said, I'd just kind of like to get right into this. We could have numerous episodes based on your experience, but I thought I'd pull 3 points from your latest book and then have you provide some more insight and commentary on it. So early on in your book's introduction, you have a section called Starting with the Unknowns or Not. The opening statement in that book pretty much made an impression on me as I was reading it, as I've experienced the following sentiments several times over the years. Reading from the book, I don't want to know and I don't care to know. If I don't know about it, it does not exist. Now that was taken in context from leadership. As shocking as it is, there are many business leaders who think this way. So, Dan, what, if anything, have you seen change over the years about this? Is it changing? And if it's not, why not? Or even more importantly, what can we do to push this change?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think overall, it's still out there. I like to say there are leaders, followers, and laggards. And there are definitely, most people who make those statements are probably in the followers and laggards category. It still exists out there in my experience. It's still, I think over the years, not as prevalent as it was maybe 10 years ago with all the different headlines last year, like the Colonial Pipeline, the gas lines in the Southeast, the headline, hospitals, Irish hospitals, health service getting hacked and JBS Meat, so many others. So I think it's becoming more and more prominent. But there's still a lot of governments, a lot of private sector businesses that, for audit reasons, they're like, if I have to do an assessment and you tell me all these things, then I have to go fix them, right? It's like, someone's like, you say, I don't want to know that my roof is leaking, or I don't want to know, you think, well, wait a minute, water's going to start dripping down on you if you don't fix this. But a lot of people, maybe they're a few years away from retirement. Maybe they're just hoping that they can outlast, the next incident, whatever. But I still think it is prevalent out there. And I think a big part of overcoming this, and it's gradually happening, is awareness. And I'm not saying I fully support all of the laws and compliance and rules about reporting, but I think a lot of that, in government and, in industry is forcing people to address cybersecurity issues.
Yeah, I think a lot of it probably comes down to they're not just not wanting to do something, but it's probably more about the cost of it and the resources they have to even take care of it. So, I've seen that a lot in several organizations and doing some consulting for businesses. I've even heard it. I have to take a step back sometimes to think about that from where they're coming from. And initially I can get really upset of hearing that because I know it's just something waiting to happen, that they're going to have to deal with something very bad in the long run if they don't take care of it. So, in one way, you'd think they would want to know what's wrong with their environment and their systems. But in another way, I certainly understand it. So, Andrew, what do you think about the idea what you don't know won't hurt you?
Well, definitely coming from a business and legal perspective, that's a very loaded question. There's a saying called, that a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. And I have a little knowledge in this area, so I don't want to be too dangerous with trying to overanalyze. But I've read that 3 or 4 years ago, the SEC had actually really started digging into this and created a rule that basically said that CEOs could not use ignorance as an excuse. Now, what's interesting about this is that, of course, the SEC covers publicly traded companies. And Dan, I know that you had worked for the state of Michigan, and private companies they're under state law from where they're incorporated. Have you seen state laws that have started to address this issue of cybersecurity, like the SEC is now apparently attempting to?
Yeah, there are laws out there, and I think in Michigan, for example, the 2004 we came out with the Identity Theft Protection Act. There's a lot of laws in most states, and I don't think all states, but most states have a data breach law that says you must report if data is compromised, those kinds of things. I think the challenge still becomes, even with the laws, it's like, again, I think Dave was right in his analysis. It's not like people are maliciously saying, don't tell me, and turning their back. It's like, it's almost like what are their other priorities? I'm just trying to fill in the blank. I'm just trying to, get taxes, collected and that kind of thing. Or I'm just trying to, whatever the business is that you're running. And those are my priorities. And cybersecurity, for whatever reason, is on the low end of that list, and maybe it's a lower priority than it should be. So.
Yeah, I think mainly the threats that are occurring in the world today and how much they've increased, and now the public exposure that we're seeing on a lot of it, I think is starting to change a lot of leadership's minds about this, because, as you know, Dan, we've always run into the problem in the IT world of we're a cost center. We don't bring income into a business. We're just a cost center. So they try to keep those costs as low as possible. And I think that plays into a lot of this. It's the term that's called plausible deniability that I have the most grief with. To me, it's almost a contradiction of a leader's responsibility for the company to do the right thing, even if they don't know what's going on. As a leader, they still should at least look into it to see, they got some responsibility here to do the right thing, specifically for their employees and their clients, and from a publicly traded standpoint, their stockholders. So I really struggle a lot with this area when it comes to cyber, and as I've led organizations as a CISO, it's not an easy thing to deal with. So I'm just kind of curious to hear you guys' ideas about this.
So plausible deniability, I would say back in the day, before this was so much in the news, maybe they could get away with this. But I don't see how anybody in this day and age can actually claim plausible deniability.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult as well. I think the technology has changed it so much. There's really no reason why. We read about companies that didn't have something corrected or fixed long before it happened, and I think we see them get into trouble by just for that fact. So, Dan, let's step through a cyber incident for a company. Chapter 5, where were you when the sirens went off? Can you give us a little of your thought process when writing this chapter?
Sure. I'd like to start with an excerpt from the book. It starts this way. Your network has been locked. You need to pay $30 million now. The following was an actual real-life negotiation between a ransomware gang and a $15 billion U.S. victim company that was hit with a $28.75 million ransom demand in January 2021. After a few rounds, the victim company counters with $2.25 million, which was met with a scornful response by the ransomware criminals. Paraphrased here. It is very funny to watch a few of your admins try to install MS Exchange server in 3 days and you can't do it. We've encrypted 5,000 of 6,000 of your servers. If we do some very simple calculation, your expenditure is like, say, $50 per hour, or maybe you're even generous and $65 per hour. So 24 hours spent to restore one server multiplied by the number of servers encrypted by us, that's like $10 million in just labor expenditures alone. It's interesting to note how these ransomware gangs have found an effective way to communicate the financial impact of business interruption caused by their cyber attacks and demonstrate how their victims will cut their losses by adhering to their demands. They continued. But don't forget that you spent all this time on installation and oops, you can't even restore any data because it's gone for like the next 1,000 years. They added that the time factor pressure at the end of the message, but also showed some mercy at the same time. The time is now ticking. Next 8 hours, your price tag will go up to $60 million. So either you take our generous offer and pay us $28.75 million or invest in quantum computing to expedite the decryption process. And I'm not going to read the rest of the whole story, which is in the book, but the company ultimately paid an $11 million ransom, with criminals assuring them that they would not attack or help anyone to attack their network moving forward. That's just one story. I mean, there's a lot more details in the book, but, really helping, I think, seeing is believing. And, back to our previous conversation, Dave, a big part of this is if people are hit with ransomware, I mean, the number of companies, I think the number is over 30% in the US and even higher in the UK and the UAE that go out of business. And so after the fact, the post-mortem, if you are hit, all the things you didn't do will not let you go, if you will. So, I mean, you're going to have to do a due diligence going back. And there are very practical things that can be done before, during, and after an incident. And this is just kind of bringing you into the situation, kind of making you see with your own eyes. Seeing is believing, and then helping you say, okay, let's go back and say, what could we have done? The good, the bad, and the ugly, real true stories, things that people wish they had known when they were hit by a ransomware attack.
Right. Yeah, I know these attacks are getting a little more sophisticated as we move along, and that's your story is evidence of threat actors that, quite frankly, have really thought through things, and they've done their research on the company that they've attacked. They know how well their IT department can take care of their systems. As evident in that story. You think about just how much the threat actors are sitting there carrying out these attacks when they know exactly what they can and can't do to you. It's kind of a scary thing. So, how do you help a leader of a company that is really not paying that close of attention to the potential impact of an attack like this?
Yeah, I think that's really why we wrote the book. Is really, to really open eyes with true stories. We can all have checklists, 10 things to do this, 5 things to do that, all the things we need to know about so many things in areas of life. And I hate to just go into sports analogies or, seatbelt analogies in car and everything. And, people say, I've heard tons of stories of people who never wore a seatbelt, and all of a sudden they start wearing a seatbelt and they find out that, they know sadly that one of the friends or a distant relative died in a car accident because they didn't have the seatbelt on or whatever. You hear those kind of stories, but you don't want it to scare people. You want to give them facts, real true stories. What happens, things that people who got through the other side, even when they did well. I wish someone had told me this. I wish I would have known. No one ever said, fill in the blank, and that's really what we do in the book is we give checklists, we give best practices, we give practical advice, but we do it in the context of surrounding it with real true stories and helping people tell their story.
Yeah, and that's a good point, Dan. I appreciate it. And again, we're speaking with Dan Lohrmann, the author of Cyber Mayday and the Day After. And I highly encourage your listeners to grab that book. It's on Amazon. I've read it. It is an excellent book. In fact, I'm on my way back through it a second time. A lot of good stuff, a lot of good takeaways there, Dan, and I really, really do appreciate it. Andrew, do you have anything you'd like to chime in here with?
I'm curious, Dan, when companies calculate possible losses, they usually go through their analysis, their most likely courses of action being the basis for those costs. But then you have your most dangerous course of action, of course, which is that those catastrophic losses. Do you think that we're actually looking at these most dangerous scenarios being the more likely scenarios these days? In other words, that they're underestimating their losses, their possible losses.
Yeah, I think I do. I mean, I think the real message is, it's almost, I hate to use another set of analogies, but it's like, there's so much you can do before a heart attack. There's so much you can do before this hits your company. There's so many practical steps you can take. That's the real message. Once it hits you and your company and all your sensitive data has been encrypted, once you've been hit with a ransomware attack, your options are not good. I mean, and I've been on shows where we spent an hour talking about, do you or do you not pay the ransom, or, and it's very, very complicated. Of course, I don't want to support criminal activity. And, it's easy to say, don't pay, just don't pay. But I know many, many companies and even governments where there were situations where, had they not paid, we're talking months, probably going bankrupt, because companies go bankrupt, never open their doors again. And they can get the data back. Even companies that have the data, but it's going to take weeks or maybe even months to restore the data, get back to the business as usual. But even if you do pay, Andrew, there's no guarantee that they're going to, you're going to be able to fully restore and get back to business anyway. So there aren't a lot of good options. And yes, many of them have very sad endings. And so, yeah, I think it's mixed. There are some very much happy endings. Sadly, it's getting worse. And 2021 was the worst year in history around ransomware. One congressional report said, this is scary numbers. It was worse than the last 10 years combined, which I find very hard to believe, but that was one research report. And it was pretty bad in 19 and 20 as well. So, we'll see if 2022 is as bad as 21, but it's really a huge issue out there.
Is there any such thing as ransomware insurance?
Absolutely. You call it cyber insurance. And there are definitely policies out there. Many corporations, many governments have them. I will tell you, the price has gone way up. just like the inflation in our economy overall right now in the U.S. But I mean, talking some people, I heard numbers from 50 to 400% increases.
Wow.
For cyber insurance. The numbers have just skyrocketed. And in many cases, the policies are being cut in half. So you had $10 million in coverage before, it's being cut to $5 million. You had $5 million, it's being cut to $2.5. And the other thing that's happening out there is insurance companies, that the losses have been so severe for insurance companies, is they're changing the rules. And so they're saying, you told us, long checklists and affidavits and things, we are doing all of these things to protect ourselves. We're encrypting the data. We're backing up the data. We're doing all these things, kind of like, again, if you got insurance on your house, all the things you would do to protect your house so that it's ready should there be, different types of problems. Same thing with businesses and companies. And then if it turns out that there's a ransomware attack and you weren't doing those things, they don't pay. So it's like, oh my goodness. So, now we're being held accountable for these checklists of items. So it's getting more expensive. The coverages are going down. But yes, there is cyber insurance, and it does help a lot of companies.
Yeah, as Dan mentioned, beginning around 2020, specifically when COVID really started hitting the nation, these things that were occurring in the cyber world and attacking companies really saw an increase in claims against their cyber insurance. And the cyber insurance industry is in a state of panic right now. They really don't know how to handle this. They don't have enough history to understand what kind of rates they should be doing. They had been playing in the field for a while and was making really good money until these large payouts started occurring, and then they started losing money. So, as Andrew, as Dan mentioned, he's absolutely correct. I've been working with the cyber insurance industry here in the Tampa area. We've got some things going here in helping them understand what's going on. And you're seeing companies that they're not even underwriting anymore. They're too afraid of it. They don't know what to charge. They don't know what their real risk level is when they start insuring a company. The cost of the policies have skyrocketed in the last 18 months to the point where you're paying more and getting less, and companies are not even starting to even buy the insurance, or whether or not they can even get the insurance right now. So yeah, that's actually a good topic for another podcast on another day, and I actually have some people in mind for that. So I'm making my notes right now, and we will actually do that. So one of the other things, Dan, that I was I've been very familiar with in the ransomware field, and I've always made this statement, because in a post-mortem of a ransomware attack on a company, when you find out what happened, you realize that it could have been prevented. And I've made a statement that I think 100% of ransomware attacks that have occurred are preventable. What do you think of that idea?
There's no doubt about it. I mean, you look at the stories behind it. In many cases, they use, as in the Colonial Pipeline, they were able to get the credentials to log into accounts, and off the dark web. A lot of our passwords, there's different. It's another one item for a show for another day for you guys. But all the credentials that are in the dark web are social security numbers, credit card numbers, login accounts for banks is one of the top ones. But had to use multi-factor authentication. For those who don't know what that is, I don't want to get real technical on you now, but requires not just a password, but maybe a text message where you type in a PIN, which I don't want to scare people away from, because I really am a big believer in that. But had they done, something as simple as MFA, that may not have happened. Now, again, you can always difficult to say, had, Johnny done this or Sarah done that, we could have prevented it. Might they have done something different? Yes. But I mean, usually we talk about in cybersecurity, it's people, process, and technology. This comes across throughout the book. And the people piece is often, usually, in fact, I'd say 80% the biggest problem. And so somebody clicks on a link, a phishing. People have heard of phishing, a bad link, they get malware downloaded. They don't use multi-factor authentication. Again, without getting into too much technology here, there's other things they can do. They reuse passwords. They don't change passwords. Those kinds of things, if done, we call it cyber etiquette, just like healthy living in cyberspace. Had they done those things more robustly, in most cases, I would say that, yes, it could be prevented. Could 100% be prevented? That's a philosophical question I don't want to get into. But I mean, I do believe that yes, when you do the postmortem, usually it's people issues. It's things like passwords that got them into the systems. It's things like clicking on links. It's things like not following best practices.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I was trying to get to the point on, Dan. It's not that, it's easy to Monday morning quarterback the game, right? We can go through it and say this should have been done or that should have been done. But most often, when it comes to a ransomware attack or a malware that's hit a company, it's usually due to the fact that something has been overlooked or not completed in their own environment that caused it, or was the avenue that what we call the threat vector to the actual attack. And that's what I mean by that. So, why I use that is because you try to educate the IT leaders and the IT people and the leaders of the company that there are certain things that you need to be doing as best practice to help mitigate the actual probability of an attack being carried out. And I think in a lot of cases that's not done for a variety of reasons. And I think a lot of this stuff, the silver lining to all of these bad attacks is that companies are starting to wake up and pay attention to it. So, from that standpoint, I hate to say it's a good thing, but there's some positive things that are coming out of these publicly announced attacks. So far we've established that ignoring these problems doesn't make them go away, and it's not a very good strategy to your company business. Cyber threats and attacks, they impact everyone, and I think everybody should understand that no one is immune. It's not limited to companies. It's individuals as well. So one of the things that we really want to help our listeners eventually get to is if you're understanding a lot of how these things are carried out, then you're more apt to do things to help protect yourself and your family as well. Dan, I'm gonna end our conversation here on this last question. What's your advice to any leaders that may be listening or senior executives in their approach to their own cyber posture?
So first of all, read my book. No, just kidding. Just kidding on that one. I'd love you to read my book if you want to get it. But, I think I'd start by leading by example. It's so many times people do what you do and not what you say. So I can't tell you, Dave and Andrew, how many times I've seen people, leadership who, they want everybody to do security awareness training. They want to have, everyone talks about a culture of cybersecurity. How do you build a culture of cybersecurity? And one of the ways is by leading by example. And there's lots of stories about that in the book. It doesn't have to take a lot of time. I remember Governor Rick Snyder in Michigan, when I was CISO in Michigan, saying, at a staff meeting, at a cabinet meeting, how many of you have taken the training? To his cabinet, no hands went up. He says, okay, I took the training. It was great training. I want each of you to take the training. I want each of your direct reports to take the training. And oh, by the way, I'm going to ask you next month. Took him 30 seconds. Didn't cost any money. Next month, he asked the same question. All the hands go up. Now, not all of them did it. Some of them actually hadn't, but they all ran back and got it all done and really led by example. So that's a great positive example. And I think, leaders need to lead by example. I think they need to pick someone who is trustworthy, can lead the effort. I think more and more people realize resources need to be provided. That means budget, that means staff, that means making this a priority. I would highly encourage leadership to make sure that they've got the right staff, the right people, and the right priority on cybersecurity.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate that. So after this break, we'll highlight the 3 points we would like for you to take from this podcast. Welcome back to 3 Point Cyber. We just finished hearing from Dan Lohrmann, a well-respected thought leader in the cyber industry. From our discussions, here are the 3 points we would like for you to take away from this episode. So, Andrew, I want you to help me out here with this. What I've got is our very first one, and Dan's still with us, by the way. So, Dan, feel free to comment on these three points that we would really like to be taken from here. So, the first one I have is no one is immune. I think that's the very first one that I want everyone to understand. No one is immune to a cyber attack. The attacks will only continue. How you prepare will determine how well you handle the incident. Don't ignore the threats and don't bury your head in the sand. So you need to own the issue. From a PR perspective, it's much better to be proactive than wait until something happens and then look foolish in front of the public by saying, we didn't know. So Dan, you have something that you'd like to add on that one?
Yeah, I just want to say that, there's so many practical, simple things people can do. And a lot of people blame it on it's too expensive, it's too costly. Many of these are free. So, I mean, even like if you use Gmail, Yahoo, use Facebook, LinkedIn, these common websites, most of them offer two-factor authentication. And maybe you have some sensitive banking information. People ask me if I'm doing online banking, I do. But I always use multi-factor authentication. And maybe you can have another episode just explaining all that to people. But it's not as hard as people think. It's usually a one-time thing. You click on it, trust this computer, and then from then on, it's really a simple password. So, but like 75% of Americans, even though it's free, don't use multi-factor authentication. 1 in 4 use it. So even there's so many practical tips that we can all put into place. If there's one thing I tell everybody to do, one thing you can take away on a personal level, it would be to turn on two-factor or multi-factor authentication on all of your online accounts, your social media accounts, your email accounts, and make sure it's being protected.
Absolutely. Thanks, Dan. Appreciate that. So let's move to number 2. I would like for everyone to take away that to help fight this, specifically for business, there are 3 plans that need a priority in your company. That's a business continuity plan, disaster recovery plan, and an incident response plan. Dan talks about that information in the book. So I'm not going to go into a lot of details here because I'm actually helping Dan out here, and I want to promote that book because, as I said before, it's an excellent read, and I highly encourage everyone to pick that book up and start reading it. Those 3 things are so critical to what happens in your company if something bad does happen. Are you planning for it? What are you doing if it does occur? How are you going to continue business? And me coming from the last several years in healthcare, business continuity is huge. If you don't have business continuity going on in your hospital operations or your healthcare operations, then you have people's lives at stake. And then the other thing that I've noticed too, and Dan, you might have seen this, is there's a big difference between a business continuity plan and a disaster recovery plan. They might be playing out at the same time, but they're 2 separate types of plans. So, if you're wondering about that, get with your cyber team, get with your cyber leadership and have that discussion. Go back to the IT department and ask them about, what these plans entail. And then obviously an incident response plan in today's world is critical. How are you going to respond when something does happen? So that's the second thing. Make those 3 plans a priority. And then finally, I think it's really important to understand that cyber is not solely a technical problem. It's a whole company issue problem. And from an individual standpoint, it's not a technical problem. It's how you are using your computers at home and what you're doing to keep your computers upgraded. Dan or Andrew, you have any questions on that?
I think you said it very well.
I'll just add one thing, and that is that, to that point, we tell some different stories. And one of the things we mention is, communication, who you're going to call, what are you going to do, given different scenarios. So scenario planning in those areas, a company-wide, what if the phones are down? What if the internet is down? What if, scenario-based planning around different businesses, functions. And I think that's a big piece of that. And like you said, it just doesn't affect IT. In fact, there may come a time when you have to run, when the power goes out, how are you going to run the business when the power goes out? Those kinds of things are all challenges that businesses face.
Very good. Dan, you have any final thoughts on this podcast?
I just want to thank you guys for having me. It's great to be on, and really, really appreciate your time.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you again, Dan, for joining us. Andrew, thanks for the co-host. Appreciate it.
And thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of 3 Point Cyber. Special thanks to Dan Lohrmann for joining us and taking time out of his day to do this podcast. This is the first of many that I hope to be sharing my passion in this cyber field with you and helping you understand some basic concepts of cyber, some topics of cyber, and any current events that may be going on. Dan certainly helped us with this, and I want to highly encourage you to pick up his book. I can't say enough about it. It is a very good read. It can be picked up at Amazon.com, and I have posted the link below along with the summary of the 3 points that have come out of this episode. We encourage you to share this podcast with others. This podcast is owned and produced by Alpha Omega Advisors. The theme song was created by music producer Andrew Van Wert in Nashville, Tennessee. This is Dave Summit, and until next time, keep on learning.